Good evening, and thank you to be with us tonight for this conference co-organized by the Political and Geostrategic Observatory of the United States at IRIS, the Academy of Political, Political Academy of Science in New York, and la chaire Raoul d'Endurant de l'Université du Québec à Montréal. So tonight we have the pleasure to have with us Robert Shapiro, President of the Academy of Political Science and professor at Columbia University. Anne-Cécile Robert, Deputy Director of Le Monde Diplomatique and Professor at IRIS SUP. And Frédéric Gagnon, directeur de la chaire Raoul d'Endurant à l'Université du Québec à Montréal, and of course Pascal Boniface, directeur de l'IRIS. So, let's go. My first question will be for you, Bob. Where are we standing today in this crazy election? What do you see? What are your pronostics?
First, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak here about the American election. These are very unusual and exciting times in the United States, and I've also been very impressed by how much the world is paying attention to this. I've talked with individuals from all over the world, academics, news commentators, and the like, and they seem to be attuned to all the details of the election, perhaps even better than a lot of people in the United States and a lot of the pundits in the United States. This election is characterized by intense partisan conflict that's been built up historically. The political parties in the United States are divided on virtually all major issues. They're divided on very emotional issues like abortion, gay rights, things related to race, immigration. Feelings are very intense. We saw that they had gotten to the point where they've boiled over with the assault on the Capitol on January 6th, related to debate about the results of the election. These issues remain, whether or not the United States will have an election this round identical to the one in 2020. It looks very possible, and we'll talk more about this when there's a discussion of how close the race is in the polls. This election's been unusual for two reasons. Things have happened that we have not seen happen before. A standing president who was nominated through the normal party nomination process decided to leave the race within a very short time of the election itself. Through a very quick process, Kamala Harris became the nominee. It was probably a very interesting and good thing for the Democratic Party that this happened, because the race at that point was such that Biden was behind in the polls, but more importantly, the Democratic electorate and even Democratic leaders and Democrats running office were very depressed about what was happening. When Kamala Harris, within 2 days of her being endorsed by Biden, was able to get enough delegates to nominate her, the level of enthusiasm among Democrats soared, equaled or even surpassed that for support for Donald Trump. She raised a great deal of money within a short period of time. The money was important, but the money was an indication of the level of enthusiasm, which has led this to be a very close race, which we'll talk more about shortly. The stakes in this election could not be greater. One stake is whether the United States can have what's perceived by everyone in the United States, let alone the world, as a free and fair election. There are all kinds of concerns about we can have a repeat of what happened after the 2020 election. But what's also at stake in this election, and this has happened because of a transformation in the Democratic Party, and I know shouldn't take too much time. Historically, in the 20th century, the presidency always went back and forth between the parties. But what began to happen, but in the 1950s, for example, and through the end of the century, for the most part, the control of Congress and the Senate remained mostly in the hands of the Democratic Party. So a Democratic president could enter office with a unified Congress, Democratic Congress, and thereby be able to control judicial appointments as well. But This changed beginning in around 1990. That is, in 1980, the Republicans won the Senate when Ronald Reagan ran for president, on his coattails, as we say. And from thereafter, they were competitive for control of the Senate. In 1994, the big debacle, was a disaster for the Democrats. Bill Clinton was in office 2 years. The Democrats lost control of the House of Representatives for the first time in a long time. Newt Gingrich, who was the speaker, thought he was the new anointed president of the United States. From thereafter, the parties were competitive for the House and the Senate. So going forward from Bill Clinton, his first 2 years in office had unified democratic government. George W. Bush had unified democratic government and Republican government. And because of that, he was able to pass major legislation on taxation. Fast forward, Barack Obama gets elected, unified democratic government with 60 senators who were Democrats, which meant that this legislation could be passed without it being filibustered by the opposite party. That is, the legislation requires 60 votes for the passage, not 50. He was able to enact healthcare reform, which upset the Republicans to no small end. Fast forward further, Donald Trump gets elected, is able to pass major tax reform. Fast forward further, Joe Biden gets elected and is able to pass all kinds of major legislation to deal with the problems caused by the COVID virus. And so the policy stakes are very high if in this election either party is able to get unified party control of the election. And I'm going to stop there.
Frédéric?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
No.
No?
Faut que tu appuies
Now,
sur le bouton.
yes. Thank you so much. Thanks, Romuald, for having me. It's good to be back at IRIS and to share the table with my distinguished colleagues. Bob said, he talked about intense partisan conflicts in the United States. Those are key words. Those are really important to remember. And if you look at the polls right now, you see this intense division between Republican and Democratic voters. I don't know if you looked at the polls concerning the November 5 election, but you can visit a website called Real Clear Politics if you want to take a look at poll averages that are, it's not the only website that you can visit, but this one is interesting because you can compare the national polls right now with national polls of the past elections in 2016 and 2020. And at the national level, if you go to this website, what you'll see right now is that on average, Kamala Harris has 49% of voting intentions nationally. And she only has a 2-point advantage over Trump right now, even though everything, even with all the things we've seen in the political arena in the U.S. in the last few years. January 6, 2021, for criminal investigations against Trump, accusations against Trump, and so on. This society is very divided. The political environment is very static right now, even though, of course, Harris has saved the day for the Democratic Party, because before Biden left the race in July 21st, it felt like there was no way for him to win this election. He was at 43%. Nationally, Trump was at 46%, but Biden had not led the race in these polls only once since September 2023. So Harris comes into the picture. There's a lot of enthusiasm on the Democratic side. You've seen the campaign events. You probably saw the Democratic National Convention with Barack Obama's speech and Kamala Harris' speech. A lot of enthusiasm, but the context is very static. And if you look at the polls, it's very tight. It's very tight. If you compare these national polls, so I said Harris is at 49, Trump is at 47 right now nationally. If you compare this to 2016, on this very same day, 8 years ago, Hillary Clinton was at 46 and Trump was at 43. So she had a 3-point advantage. The race right now is closer than it was 8 years ago when Clinton was in the picture. And you remember what happened in November 2016. She won the national vote. Clinton got 48% of the vote. Trump got 46%, but he secured the presidency because he won in the Electoral College. You're familiar with that system. The U.S. doesn't elect the president with the national vote. It doesn't matter if you get more votes than your opponent nationally. you have to win in the Electoral College. And in 2016, Trump surprised Democrats in 3 states that we will have to follow again on November 5. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And Trump won in 2016 these states by only a few tens of thousands of votes. But if you look at the national polls that I just told you about, 2020, you see that with that 2-point advantage, maybe Harris is in that same kind of situation right now. We'll see what happens on November 5, but she might well win the national vote, the popular vote, but lose in the Electoral College. Because if you look at the key states of the elections, you will see that observers are talking about 7 states to watch, okay? North Carolina, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, the Sun Belt states that are in the southern part of the US, and 3 Rust Belt states in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If you look at the polls right now, you see that in these states, the race is even closer than it is nationally, okay? The difference between Trump and Harris in all these states is often less or around 1%. There was a poll that was published a few hours ago by the New York Times and Siena College. You see that Trump is even leading, according to this poll, by 3 or 4 points in states like Arizona. So it's very, very close in these states. The good news for Kamala Harris is the following. If she wins all the Democratic states that we expect her to win on November, I'm talking about California, New York, Massachusetts, Oregon, the state of Washington, and so on. These are states that will vote Democratic unless there's a big surprise. So if she wins these states, in addition to Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where she's often leading in the polls, but by 1%, sometimes 1.5%, it's very close. But if she wins Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she will keep the keys of the White House. But the result of such a scenario would be, in the Electoral College, 270 for Kamala Harris, 268 for Donald Trump. You need a minimum of 270 votes in the Electoral College to secure the presidency. But with that scenario, if you look at the polls, that's one possible scenario, but she only gets the minimum to keep the keys of the White House. Now, let's go back to 2020. The race was not as close as this. Biden, on September 24, 4 years ago, was leading by 7 points nationally. The final vote, the final tally, popular vote, was 51% for Biden, 47% for Trump. Okay, but in the Electoral College, 5 states made a huge difference: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin again, and Arizona, Georgia. Those are states to watch also. But in 2020, the race was not as close as it is this year. But if you look at these 5 states I just mentioned, Biden won again only by a few tens of thousands of votes. It's closer now. We don't know what's going to happen at the Electoral College, but I think that's one of the reasons why Kamala Harris is saying we are underdogs right now. Trump is leading. We're leading nationally, but we have a tough road ahead in the Electoral College. And of course, if the election is very close, if you have a scenario of 270, 268 for Harris in the Electoral College, I think you can expect Trump to challenge the results. He did so in 2020 when the race was not even as close as this. You can expect that Trump will not recognize the results of the election. So here we go again. I think we're going to be in a similar scenario than in 2020, but this time with an even closer election. I don't know if you know, Nate Silver is one of the key experts of American elections in the US. He has a website called the Silver Bulletin with a model, a predictive model. He talks about the 2000 scenario on his website. And I think it's interesting. 24 years ago, if you remember, maybe you weren't born, but I guess you were. It was Al Gore against George W. Bush. And the race came down to 537 votes only in one state of the union, Florida. And I think you remember the scenario. We didn't know who was president for weeks. The Supreme Court decided to, we asked the Supreme, not me, not us, but some people asked the Supreme Court, what should we do with the recount in Florida? And the Supreme Court made a landmark decision, very important decision that gave the presidency to W. Bush. So imagine you have a similar scenario to that on November 5 or in the weeks that follow November 5. You have one state where a decision has to be made. Let's say it's 2,000 votes in Pennsylvania, for instance, and there's a controversy. and there are courts that follow that have to make decisions on this issue, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. You might know what's the composition of the Supreme Court right now. 6 conservative judges, 3 progressive judges, and this Supreme Court just made a decision, another landmark decision, in favor of Trump on the question of presidential immunity. So the key word is popcorn. Buy a lot of popcorn. You will need a lot of popcorn on November 5 and the days that follow the election, and maybe in the weeks that follow this election. It's going to be exciting, and I agree with Bob. Very exciting election and a very tight one. Si la tendance se maintient, as we say in French. Thank you.
Bob.
I just want to interject a couple of facts here. In terms of how close these elections can be. Donald Trump won the 2016 election with a little over 70,000 votes in 3 states. Biden won the 2020 election by 40,000 votes in 3 states. And there's a big fight going on in the state of Nebraska about whether or not they should allocate. Nebraska is a weird state. They have 4 electoral votes. 2 of them are not determined by who wins the majority in the state, but by the congressional districts. And the Republicans want to change this so it becomes winner take all, because Republicans will win the state. But the Democrats have won the 1 congressional district, and they want to take that away. And Kamala Harris may need that 1 electoral vote to reach 270.
Pascal?
Thank you. When we were in Colombia in April discussing US election, the perspective was frightening because Trump was sure to be elected, because Biden was his contender and Biden was already out of states, and everybody knows that it will be very hard for him to survive. So he has decided to leave the course and to leave the race, and now Kamala Harris is decided, but as you have stated, the perspective is still threatening, because there is 2 perspectives. Nobody knows who will win. It could be Trump, it could be Harris, and we know, everybody knows that you could win the national vote, but not the Electoral College. And we know also that the Republicans are favored by the National College, because they are, even if every time the Democrats are more numerous to vote, but there is more delegates for the Republican. And in fact, there is 2 solutions if Trump is elected. I think that the world will be in turmoil on US as well. But if Trump is losing, of course, I think that he won't accept his defeat as he has done in 2020, because in 2020 he could have the choice between Mar-a-Lago or the White House. Now the choice is between jail and the White House. And so it's much more frightening for him. And as Romuald has very clearly stated in the video we have made this morning, now the Republican Party is much more united around Trump than in 2020. There is no more Mike Pence regarding telling that we have to defend the Constitution, to defend the USA. So it's not the same Republican Party than 4 years ago. So it's a MAGA party. It's not the Republican Party. So all wise Republicans are not there. They are loose and they are expelled from the party, like Lisa Cheney and so on. And so I will just start regarding the world. So what kind of image the US will give if there is a strong contestation? We had election in Senegal 3 months ago, so just before the summer, and the president accepted his defeat and gave the keys of the power to his contender, the same one who was in jail just before. But they have accepted a real race and a real contestation of power. So now I think that in Africa, in some African countries, the rules of democracy are more respected, perhaps, than in USA. Frederick has reminded the example of 2000. It was a scandal to have only 500 votes in the state in which the brother of the candidates was in power. So just imagine the same things in Rwanda or in with Mobutu. It will be a scandal, and so which is very frightening. It's American democracy was a model for a lot of countries, even in France, and we appreciate the check and balances. We appreciate the freedom of press. We appreciate a lot of things, and now I think that this state is threatened by the will-be contestation of the result by one of the main contender, who was president just before. And so there is a real challenge for U.S. democracy and therefore for democracy in the world, because it will be a gift, a Christmas gift in November, if there is a lot of contest of U.S. election. And I think that Xi Jinping, Putin, a lot of people will be more than happy to see that, to say, you see, democracy is not a good model. Democracy is not working anymore. And the real model is authoritarian ruler. And so it's not only, of course, US is a more important country in the world, and of course, whatever the choice, it's very important. And that's why in every country, could be democracy, could be authoritarian regime, everybody is looking at US election, because in fact, it's a worldwide election. From Senegal to Haiti, from China to Zimbabwe, everybody is concerned by US election, even only it's normal, only US citizens are voting. But the model is very important, and there is a political side effect and strategical side effect of US election contested by the main contender. And so that's why it's a very, and which is frightening. It's 268, 270, and in 3 states with a very thin margin of voters. So 30,000 people could decide of the sake of US and by the way of the sake of the world. So it's really something which plunges us in a large perspective of thinking, and I think it's very uncomfortable. Of course, we were uncomfortable in April to see that Trump is sure to win, but we are not very reassured now to see the multiple possibilities of contesting the election and giving a very bad signal to the rest of the world.
What is really frightening is when we think about what J.D. Vance said, my loyalty goes to Trump before the Constitution. We never heard something like that before in America. So yes, imagine what will happen if Trump loses. Anne-Cécile.
Well, thank you very much. I hope my English is not too rusty, because I don't speak English very often. So, well, you help me, please. What strikes me in this campaign, and I watched a bit of the Republican convention and the Democratic convention, is what Robert just said. It's very emotional, and we don't talk much about politics. It's all about image, feelings, caricature. And this campaign looks like a fight between the right and wrong, good and evil. Of course, Trump being the dangerous phony that we are all afraid of, and the Democrats being the good guys in the race. But this is absurd. This is very artificial. And it's really impressive to see how Democrats now praise Kamala Harris. They hated her a few months ago. You know, they couldn't stand her. She was too right-winged. She was, even as a VP, she was too shallow. And now she's like a hero. She's going to save the world. This is absurd. This is so artificial. And what's dangerous is that while we are dealing with our emotions, trying to fight evil with Trump, we don't talk about the reasons why Trump was elected last time. And those reasons are still there. I mean, the United States is a very divided country with social and economic forces building huge walls between Americans. And Trump wasn't elected. It was for a reason. And I remember talking with Romuald in 2016. Everybody around us said what was thinking Clinton was going to be elected, and we were saying, no, Trump is going to be elected. Because we looked around us and we were listening to the American people, and they are still angry. I mean, they are still angry. People in America are still angry. And if this campaign goes on like this, the American democracy won't deal with what divides the American people. And the risk that Trump is elected is very high to me. And the second thing I wanted to say is that what strikes me is that this campaign is very much about domestic issues and not so much about international affairs, foreign policy. Well, sometimes it can be a relief because when the Americans get involved in foreign policy, it sometimes end up with wars, strange and dubious alliances in the Middle East with dangerous kind of governments. But still, we are living a turning point in history. There are major crises everywhere, Ukraine, the Middle East, in Africa, and the United States is obviously a part of this big mess. So can we go on with a country that has so much responsibility in the world, that has no precise vision of what it should do on the world stage? And I say no precise vision because I read what Kamala Harris said in her speech in the convention and what I heard what Trump said. It's all about the strengths of America, making America great again for Trump, but for Kamala, it's the same thing. In other words, the army must be strong. We must fight the nasty Chinese, repel the Russian aggression. So they are all with caricature, very simple ideas of what's going on the world, and it's very dangerous. And to us Europeans, it may present us with very big difficulties. Because what the United States will do will have a huge influence on us. And especially I'm thinking about Ukraine. By the way, I don't know if you agree with me, but the only real difference between Trump and Harris concerning foreign policy is Ukraine. Trump said he will, cut a deal in 24 hours with the Russians, okay? But on every other issues, Harris and Trump are just, they agree on Gaza, on Israel, on China, on Africa, on Europe. Just Ukraine is the only difference between the two. And to us, European, it will make a big difference if it's Trump concerning the Ukraine war, because I don't know if Europe can deal alone with the Russians and with such a big issue as this war. But so I'm going to leave it there. I hope the American democracy will come back very quickly to real politics and leave the emotional field, because that's very dangerous. It's a way to blind ourselves from the real issues.
Bob, what do you think about what Anne-Cécile just said? And do you think that American democracy is really at risk if Trump is elected?
Well, if Trump is elected in a free and fair election, the threat to American democracy has to do with things that Trump might do to undermine the American government and undermine democracy. For one, he has a vengeful view toward the deep state, that is the national bureaucracy, which he thought did not serve him well when he was president. And so this was part of the 2025 project, which he denies having anything to do with. But the kinds of things he's been saying is basically changing rules with regard to executive officials, eliminating those who are in civil service positions and replacing them with political appointees. It's this Schedule F thing that everybody talks about in the United States. And if he does that, that'll give him greater control of the bureaucracy. The other thing we're talking about in terms of a threat to democracy, he's basically talking about going after members of the Biden administration, the Justice Department, basically all his political enemies, and taking them to court and locking them up. He actually uses that particular kind of language. So those are the things that are immediate threat. That's if he wins a free and fair election. I think that the bigger potential threat here is what happens if he loses and doesn't recognize the results of the election. And there are a bunch of moving parts here. And Romuald, please stop me if I'm going on too long here. First and foremost, the result of the election hinges on the recognition of the accuracy of the state vote counts. And in particular, in the state of Georgia, which really held firm in terms of an accurate count there, despite Trump's efforts to try to change the vote there by making a phone call to the authorities and asking them to find an additional 1,000 votes, and then saying very angry things toward the governor of Georgia and the Secretary of State of Georgia. The question is, if he loses states like that, will the governors basically take him on? Now, certainly the Democratic governors will, but the question is, will the Republican governors? But here, the main Republican governor at stake here is the state of Georgia, and then there's the question of what the Republicans are trying to do in terms of making it more difficult for people to vote. There have been new rules established in state elections requiring voter identification, making access to polling places less. There've always been the only real complaint about potential thwarting of people voting have been long lines in certain states at polling places. That's the only documented case of real difficulties. But the question is, will people be prevented from voting because of inadequate identification? And also, the Republicans are trying to basically send out monitors to monitor voting at polling places. And in some states, an individual can challenge whether a person online is eligible to vote. So there are those kinds of things. And then the thing that can most undermine the election is if the Republicans once again try to make changes that to persuade states not to choose put forward the delegates that were voted on by the electorate, but to put forward an alternative slate of delegates because the vote in the state was somehow fraudulent. There's the widespread potential for that again as well. Those kinds of things, as was pointed out earlier, will have to be contended with through legal proceedings in the courts. There's actually a schedule for doing all of this stuff, and we like to think that the election officials and the courts are poised to actually deal with these problems that arise quickly. And then the last threat is the potential for violence once more, a potential assault on the Capitol. There are things that are different now. The Biden administration is basically putting things in place to secure the Capitol when those kinds of things occur. There's one huge difference between this election in 2020, and that difference is that the President of the United States is not Donald Trump, it's Joe Biden. He's the one in charge of the National Guard overseeing security in the nation. And keep in mind here, he actually has greater power now because the Supreme Court decision that gives presidents immunity now gives him immunity to basically do whatever he wants.
Eric, some point?
Yeah, what Bob just said is very fascinating, and I think it's true that Biden has power this time, is in charge, but the electoral context has also evolved. When you compare 2024, you see in states like Georgia, we conduct field research for our research projects. We're not too far from the US, we live in Canada, and each time there's an election, we go in these key states that I mentioned to interview members of both parties, Democratic campaign directors, but also Republican campaign the bénévoles, as we say in French, campaign directors, etc. And it's always fascinating for us to see how much effort local officials at the state level in key states, how much effort they put into this election to try to find, as Bob was saying, little rules and little procedures that could enable them, not Trump, but local officials could enable them to fight this fight with Trump should he want to challenge the results of the election. We met a guy in Wisconsin in 2022, right before the midterm elections, and he was saying, I'm trying to make sure that the vote will get out, that people will go vote for the party, but I'm also monitoring the election and trying to make sure that everything's going to be democratic. There are many people who are still convinced in the GOP that there was a major fraud in the 2020 election, even though this election has been studied and verified over and over again. But many people in the party, or they're not convinced of that, but they say it because it can be useful to say it and to motivate their voters. But some people are still convinced that there's a lot of fraud in the electoral system. And when we went to a Trump rally in Manchester, New Hampshire last January, Trump rally, we went there in person. So Trump gives his 2-hour speech, but he says, and you see a PowerPoint behind him with slides, photos of Joe Biden saying Democrats are a threat to democracy also. And the country is very divided, and you might have noticed lately that from Biden to Harris, there's been a change in strategy on the Democratic side. Biden was always insisting on the fact that Trump is a threat to democracy. But the Democratic Party doesn't put emphasis on that as much as before. Why? Because I think they found out that the argument doesn't work as much as they would like. Because if you look at the polls, you see that the society is so divided that you have as many people in the country who think Democrats are a threat to democracy as Republicans who think, as Democrats who think the other side. So I wasn't clear, but if you look at the polls, you see the same amount of people who think their political opponents are a threat to democracy. So if you're the Democratic Party, you can say Trump is a threat to democracy. You will win your base. But I don't think well, that's their strategy. They found out maybe that they cannot enlarge the coalition, the Democratic coalition, by insisting over and over again that Trump is a threat to democracy, because there are still 47% of people who are still ready to vote for him on November 5. And you saw after the second assassination attempt against him, I can't believe I just said that, second assassination attempt against Trump, he tried to turn the argument to his advantage by saying, people want to kill me because Democrats say all the time that I'm a threat to democracy. So they might be threatening the system by emphasizing all the time that I am a threat to democracy. So it's a different context. You have more people who are ready to believe that the Democratic Party is also a threat to democracy. It's a very divided society. And at the local level in key states like Georgia, Wisconsin, you have people who are ready to fight the fight at the local level and help Trump challenge the election, just like Bob said.
Pascal, can we expect, regarding American foreign policy, in case Trump is reelected?
So maybe I will have a little bit difference with Anne-Cécile regarding the differences between Harris and Trump. On 2 key points, Gaza and China, they agreed. They agreed. And of course, Kamala Harris has stated that Israel has a right to self-defense, and that she will support unconditionally Israel in the fight against Hamas and so on. On China, maybe it could have a change because Elon Musk is playing a very big role in Trump team, and Musk has a huge interest in China. And so we were very impressed to see that Trump was against TikTok, the TikTok application 6 months ago, and now he's agreed to have TikTok in USA because one of his main contributor is a big owner of Biden's, the owner of TikTok. And so I think that Trump could have a different approach with China, asking to Beijing to buy a huge amount of agricultural products and so on, and to have a transitional approach, not ideological approach, which he doesn't mind of human rights either in China or elsewhere. On Israel, the policy will be the same. On Russia and Ukraine, I think that even if Kamala Harris is elected, at the end of the day, USA won't stand with Ukraine for long because it's too costly and there is no perspective. And I don't know what kind of victory plan Zelensky will show tomorrow, after tomorrow, to Biden, but there is no victory act site for Ukraine. Only maybe the division of the... So Ukraine will never win back all the territories it had lost since February 22. And I think that even Kamala Harris will say that, in fact, Arizona will... I prefer Arizona to Ukraine, yeah, and that 60,000 billions of dollars every year is just not possible anymore. And of course, for the United Nations, for NATO, for Asian countries, Trump is a fearful perspective. But I'm not sure that it will be the end of NATO, because at the end of the day, the Pentagon and the State Department will say to Trump, we are not in NATO for Europeans. We are in NATO for ourselves. And our interest is to be in NATO and to ask to Europeans to buy more weapons and to buy more American products and so. And I'm quite sure that a lot of European countries will agree to pay a little bit more, Poland, Baltic states, and so on, and that France and Germany won't be in a majority to oppose this kind of approach. And even we have seen that Biden is a good ally on a strategic issue, but on economic issue, he's a rival. He's not a European ally, because the Inflation Reduction Act, not to mention AUKUS for the French side. So of course, there is difference. Of course, Kamala Harris is a more decent woman than Trump. Of course, for United Nations, for the World Health Organization, for these all international bodies, it will be better to see Kamala Harris than to see Trump. But in fact, I think that Trump will be kind of hell for the world, but Kamala Harris won't be a paradise. She will do better, she will don't do worse, but on many issues, we have to define our own interest. And in this way, Biden election has been something which sent Europeans to imagine the resuming of ideal solution, ideal relations between US and European countries, but we have different interests in many fields. And this difference of interest has been hidden by the fear of Trump. So, of course, I will prefer Kamala Harris than Trump, but we will still have a lot of things to do, even if Harris is elected. And I don't think that Kamala Harris would be a multilateralist president.
Cécile?
Well, just one comment on what Frederick said, or maybe a question. I still really don't get why the American electoral system is so complicated. Because I understand people have already started to vote 2 months before the election, so that's very strange. And I'm not sure that it's very fair, because you think something in September, but so many things can happen and you can change your mind. So it's very strange, odd to let people vote so early before the election. And that leads to doubt. Of course, I don't know what they do with the ballot, with everything. They put it in a storage room. In Africa, they do that a lot. And nobody ever understands well, we understand that in the end, what the dictator or the president has done with the ballots in question. But this is really weird to us that such an old democracy, a modern democracy, has so ancient and very weird practice in the way that people vote. But maybe you have some comments and insights for us on this. Concerning foreign policy, well, maybe Pascal is maybe more clairvoyant than I can be on Chinese-US relations. What I read and hear is this will from both sides to lead the world America still wants to lead the world in spite of everything that's going on, in spite of the failure of the wars they led in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in spite of their moral failure in Gaza, in Israel. They are still in this position to lead the world, and that's very scary. And I don't trust any of them. I have no candidate in this election. Trump, Harris, well, I'm just going to check what they will do on the world stage. And I'm really not at ease with either of them. And what I fear, Pascal talked about the United Nations, is that Democrats and Republicans are both using a new expression that is the rules-based order, l'ordre fondé sur des règles, the rules-based order, instead of international rights, UN Charter. If you hear and read them, they speak about the rules-based order instead of the UN Charter and international law. And why does it matter? It matters because we know what is international law. We know what's written in the UN Charter, and there are courts like the ICJ to check that the UN Charter and international law is respected. Nobody knows what the rules-based order is. I mean, the Americans, they make it up as they go along, you know, and they pick the rules they want to shape the world. And now they are leading the world, and the Europeans too, in their fight against China, against Russia, with the rules-based order. And I hear that the Europeans, the French diplomats, they are beginning to use this expression. We need to stop because nobody knows what's in the rules-based order. So it's very dangerous because it's a way of breaking the world order that we built in 1945 with the consensus that we had a lot of, it was very hard to reach this consensus with the Soviets, with the Chinese and Americans, everybody. It was very hard, and you remember the historical context. So when the Americans use this expression, it looks like, you know, no problem, it's nice. Who could be against a rules-based order? But it's very dangerous. And both parties, Democratic and Republicans, are preparing us to what? To crusades. To crusades in a world where there are no rules, except the rules that they make for themselves. So this is very dangerous, and I would hope that the French and the Europeans could stand against that and defend the United Nations, even though we can criticize the United Nations, the UN Charter and international law. And very concretely, stand with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and the ICC to defend international law. That's the difference between rules-based order and international law is precisely in what the ICC is doing today and in the ICJ is doing today. So
unfortunately, United States is not really interested anymore in the legacy of World War II and United Nations, etc. Multilateralism is dead for them. Pascal.
In fact, Anne-Cécile has made the precision I want to make. In fact, it's American rules-based order. And the difference, if you are for world rules-based order, you accept UN decision, you accept permanent criminal court, and you sign the status of Rome Treaty and so on, which is not the case of US. So I think it's just it's a joke to speak about rule-based order when you were the first one to break the rules.
Frédéric, in 2 minutes, if you can
we always say that
international relation and Canadian-American relation.
We always say that Canadians are polite, so I will leave the question about the American political system to my American colleague since he teaches American government at Columbia University. But when it comes to US foreign policy and this discussion about American interests, um, you know, Trump came into the picture in 2016 with a slogan, "America First," and I don't think we've left that. I don't think we've left that environment. We've left that thought, even though Biden was elected president in 2020. Of course, Biden doesn't say America first, but he also wants to protect American interests first on many foreign policy issues, and especially on trade. I think Pascal said that there's not a lot of difference for Europe, at least, between Trump and Biden when it comes to protectionism and trade. The tools are different. Of course, Trump wants to rely more on tariffs against China, but also against allies, Europe, Canada. We felt that during the Trump presidency. He imposed, just like to Europe, he imposed tariffs on various Canadian exports, steel and aluminum, for instance. And now if you look at his platform, you see that he wants to impose even more tariffs, not only on China's exports, but also on allies' exports in the future, if he feels that allies are not nice enough to American workers, American farmers, and so on. But Biden was elected, and that's why these three states that I mentioned are so important: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That's where you've seen a growing discontent with globalization, with trade, with NAFTA when it comes to Canada and Mexico. The fact that we should sign new trade deals in the future, that we should make sure that job creation happens not only in the US, but in the world thanks to free trade. Biden isn't the same kind of thought. He said in 2020 that he would protect American jobs first, not with tariffs against allies, but with the Inflation Reduction Act, this big law that is aimed at boosting US industrial production in these states that we're always talking about, among others, but Pennsylvania, steel, Michigan in the auto industry. Biden promises to transform the auto industry, but he's like Trump. He promises great jobs in this sector with different tools. He relies on federal investments to boost production of cars and of good manufacturing jobs in this region. He doesn't rely on tariffs as much as Trump, but both parties, both presidents, and Harris, I think, is pretty much the same. She voted against the new trade deal between Canada and Mexico in the US Senate. If you look at what she's saying on the campaign trail right now, she says, I want to protect small petites entreprises, les petites et moyennes entreprises on American soil. I want to make sure that we will protect American jobs first. So the context is very different than the one we saw after World War II. And for Canada, it's been very tough because we share the longest undefended border with the US. Our trade, our economic development and health depends heavily on trade with the US. 75% of our exports internationally go to the US. So when you have a president who says we will impose tariffs on steel and aluminum coming from Canada, when you have a president, Biden, who says we have the Inflation Reduction Act, we'll make sure that Americans buy cars made in the US, not made in North America, it gets more difficult for a small country, middle power like Canada. And I will stop by saying also that if you look at what Trump is proposing right now when it comes to immigration, he says that he wants to the deportation. I know that this word in Europe is not. We don't like to use this word in Europe for obvious reasons, but in the U.S. context, they use the word to describe a situation where Trump would like the deportation of 11 million undocumented immigrants who live on U.S. soil right now. They won't be able to do that tomorrow if he's reelected, but J.D. Vance said we will start with 1 million. So we will have policies that will force migrants who are on U.S. soil undocumented to go back home. But the thing for Canada, we share a border with the U.S. Many of these migrants might not want to go back home to Honduras, Salvador, and countries where the situation is very difficult. So what's their other option? They can look north. They can come to Canada. So that's going to be a very important election for us. But I agree with Pascal. It's not If Harris is reelected, it's not 100% better for an ally like Canada on trade. It will remain difficult because I conclude with this: this country is more convinced than before that it should protect its national interests first, and it's the same on with other regions, with Europe and other countries as well.
Bob, your view on a hypothetical Trump foreign policy or Harris foreign policy? You have
I
5
want
minutes.
to say a couple things with regard to immigration and the threat that might be posed to Canada. Of course, there's this lingering possibility that that if Trump wins, there may be Americans who may be leaving the country. Right. I say that only half.
Will you come back?
No, I'm staying. Okay. Okay. With regard to the crazy American electoral system, now with this early voting, there are two kinds of early voting. There's in-person early voting, and there's mail-in voting. The mail-in ballots are counted on election day. It varies by state, but in some of the key states, they're counted last, so that the early voting that comes in by mail in the past elections have been predominantly more Democratic than Republican, and they're also allegedly ballots that could be more subjected to fraud, and so there's that kind of concern. The in-person votes will be counted on, I assume, on election day right away. Things can happen between now and the election. The only thing that would really mess things up is if for some reason Trump were to either bow out or for some reason not be the Republican candidate, and if he were replaced, you have people who've already voted for him, and that will cause all kinds of confusion. With regard to foreign policy, I think there's one difference between the two candidates, and it's a more subtle one. Democratic presidents have been more supportive of engaging in diplomacy and alliances, and with one difference between Trump and Harris, I presume, would be Harris would be more attuned to using alliances as a way to constrain the Chinese and to shore things up in Europe in ways that Trump would not readily do. This is not going to be an election issue. The one possible election issue, and it's a lingering one, is the war right now in Israel against the Palestinians, not just Hamas now, but now it's obviously Lebanon and Hezbollah brought in. That could be an issue for a certain segment of the American public, young voters who've been very attuned to those issues. We've seen it on college campuses, and in close elections, young voters can have a big effect. In the last elections, they've broken about 63% Democrat, 37% Republican. Any change in that could affect the election. Now, it's clearly the case that Trump is no different from Biden and Harris with regard to Israel and the Palestinians. But these groups that have normally been part of the Democratic base have been feeling betrayed by the Democrats, by Biden and perhaps Harris as well. And there are anecdotal stories that, particularly among American Arabs and Palestinian Americans, they anecdotally, people have said, particularly in the state of Michigan, they would vote for Trump because of their just basically taking revenge against the Democrats on that particular issue. Other voters that might be affected are minority voters blacks and Latinos who basically oppose oppression in any form against people of color. And it's probably would be the most important issue in Michigan because of its large Palestinian American and Arab American population.
Thank you. Some question?
No microphone.
We don't have a micro.
So my question I would like to ask, it's about the, I remember like the old CIA agent, Edward Snowden. I remember like Edward Snowden, why he was, for example, against the US system or like the American politics, because I guess it's about like the, was it the like, for example, like the US government was watching the civilians during, for example, by the TV and the computer systems, and the also telephone with camera. So it was not that he was against the Republicans or the Democratic. And then, for example, I understand that he is the one of the horrible history of horrible history in the U.S. So what was the point of Edward Snowden that he did this, for example, this scandal about the American politics?
Anne-Cécile? No?
I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about.
Edward Snowden.
Edward Snowden. Snowden. You know. Okay, can you repeat your question, because I think I didn't totally understand. Did you?
Well, my question that he was against the Democratic or the Republicans, and why he, for example, did this scandal in the United States, that like he moved to Russia and he said like bad stuff about US.
When we
Well,
I
think that is nothing. There's nothing relevant to that to the current election. That's my view.
We can just see that when it comes to spying on allies, Democrats and Republicans are all the same.
Exactly the same. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation, the panel. So my question is very specific about what's going on in the Middle East at the moment with Hezbollah and Israel, and how that's going to affect the outcome of the US elections and how young people perceive Kamala. Because I studied in the United States in Charlotte in Davidson College, and I've seen firsthand how after the war started in Gaza, how students have changed their attitudes towards Democrats, saying that we're not going to vote for Democrats. And I'm in North Carolina, which is also a swing state, and it's very important that everybody goes and votes these elections. But now with Hezbollah, although Kamala has built this image of herself as kind of more neutral than Trump or Biden on the Gaza-Israel war, now this Hezbollah war is kind of pushing the US government to support Israel more, and this might change the perception of young people, of Democrats at the moment. So I'm curious to hear more from you about how what's going on now, what's escalating in the Middle East, is going to affect the elections. Thank you.
Bob? Okay, but next time, let's go, but next time, wait, that we ask you is better. Okay.
Thank you. Just to ask Professor Shapiro also his opinion, you were talking about the disillusioned youth, and as the other participant was saying, the issue in the Middle East. So some analysts are saying that Kamala is not separating herself from Biden in many of her in her speeches and the comments that she has made so far, but because she's a younger, more open candidate, we could expect her in the future to take distance from some of these things and change her attitude. Is there anything in her track record as a senator or as vice president that could really suggest that this is something we could expect in key issues like Gaza, fracking, the environment? Yeah. Thanks.
Well, with regard to the Gaza and now Hamas and Hezbollah, there's nothing in her record that would suggest that she would deviate in a very sharp way. On the other hand, there's reason for her to be quiet about what she might do as president. And there's this big there's a little psychological game going on here. That is, young voters may be thinking of her as someone different, and they might be willing to take a risk, rather than voting for Trump out of revenge or voting for another third-party candidate or not voting at all, to vote for her to keep Trump out, who they might think is definitely a bad guy on this. He's going to support Netanyahu, to the maximum, I would think, since they're sort of cut from the same cloth, as we say. They might be willing to take a risk that she would come around and be persuaded. And keep in mind, a president, once the president's elected, has a lot of leeway. They could take risks and try to go big on different policy areas. The next presidential election is 4 years off, and the next midterm election is 2 years off. So they could take chances there. And the question is, would they be willing to take a risk, vote for the lesser of two evils? And thus far, the youth vote has been breaking close to 60-40. And so, which is good for the Democrats. And if that were to tilt more toward Trump, that would be, they would wind up electing Trump. So it's kind of, there's sort of a cat and mouse game going on here potentially.
Hi, I have two different questions. The first one on Elon Musk. I think you evoked his name briefly at some point. Could you elaborate a little bit more on his role in the election and his potential role in the Trump administration? And second question on interference from other powers or potentially groups in other countries and the use of AI or different technologies in the election right now. Is it something important or is it something marginal at the moment?
Yes, maybe a few words about Elon Musk. You saw that Trump gave him an interview, a long interview on X. I think it was a month ago or something like that. So Elon Musk has decided to support Trump to give him a lot of visibility on this platform. How does it translate into votes? It's very difficult to measure, but of course, Elon Musk can be popular maybe among certain voters, male voters around his age, maybe voters who don't usually vote in presidential elections also, who are not super interested in politics. I think that's the gamble that Trump is trying to make. And he's trying to do that. If you look at where he goes or how you were talking, Anne-Cécile, about the conventions this summer. Conventions, political conventions have always been a show, a big advertising for parties. But it was interesting to watch the Republican one this year. The people who were there, Hulk Hogan, okay, former pro wrestler, Dana White, who's in charge of Ultimate Fighting Championship in the US, the extreme fighters who fight in a ring. And Trump goes to these events. He's trying to seduce Elon Musk, not only because of that, but one reason I think is he tries to convince a certain type of voters to go vote on November 5. Men, male, who are not happy with wokeism in the United States, who are not happy with the fact that the Democratic Party has become too radical to them. The fact also for Elon Musk that Trump promises to extend tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations and for billionaires like him. So I think he's going to play a role. And when it comes to the role he could play in a Trump administration, I don't have a crystal ball, but it's been said that he might be at the head of an agency that would be responsible to cut federal spendings, executive spendings within the administration, and blah blah blah. Would he have another role? I don't know, but that's the kind of things they've been discussing. And when it comes to the second question, well, you saw Merrick Garland, who was the Secretary of Justice a few weeks ago. He stated publicly that two individuals from Russia had paid for an important campaign, disinformation campaign in the U.S. Two individuals who were linked to Russia Today and who paid an American-based firm to share this information and information about the Russian-Ukraine conflict, favorable to Putin, favorable to the Russian government on social media. So the government, the US government, the Biden administration is saying that Russia is still trying to play that kind of role in this election. Russia did so in the 2020. There are reports about that. They talk about China also to a lesser extent or a different extent, but that will be another factor to watch in the election. The problem with that, again, I don't know if Bob will agree with me, but it's, again, very difficult to measure clearly the impact of a disinformation campaign from abroad on votes. Nate Silver tried to do so in 2016, and he concluded that it's impossible to measure the impact of this campaign on Hillary Clinton's loss, even though she says in her book that Russia played a role in her defeat. It's very difficult to measure, almost impossible to measure. And the other problem is that in this country now, disinformation also comes from the political actors within the society. You can look at Trump's Truth Social account. The Republican Party has been using AI to depict the kind of world the US would be like if Biden is reelected, apocalyptic world, and blah, blah, blah. And Trump, you know that, we all know that, he doesn't hesitate to share disinformation on his website. on this website, J.D. Vance also is playing that kind of game. And the latest example is what they say about migrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating cats and dogs and other animals. It's never been proven, but they don't care. They want to win elections, and I think it shows that U.S. democracy is not healthy when political opponents don't even hesitate to rely on those kind of strategies to win elections.
Say something?
Two things. Trump has Elon Musk. Kamala Harris has Taylor Swift. They kind of cancel out. No, but
Billie Eilish.
Yeah. No, but in terms of, I agree completely about how difficult it is to measure the effect of these different disinformation campaigns. The problem there is that there's so many communications that people are overwhelmed with, and for those communications to have an effect, two things have to happen. One is people have to be exposed to it, and secondly, they have to be persuaded by it. And because of selective exposure, people may be focused on only messages that agree with what they already think. And moreover, persuasion turns out to be very difficult as well, as people have studied efforts at leadership and the like. In terms of the 2016 election, what the Russians and other countries are doing is bad. Okay, and should be stopped. In terms of their net effect, I think in this election they're being drowned out by other things. I think the messages about eating pets in Springfield, Ohio, completely swamps whatever the Russians and other countries are doing.
Question for you, Pascal, from one of our viewers. Who would be the best for European Union, Harris or Trump?
So it depends, because of course Trump could create a shock, wake-up call for Europe. But I think that European countries will be divided. The Baltic states and Poland and Czech Republic, Slovakia will say, oh, please stay and we'll pay more, we'll buy more weapons, and we will accept more direction from USA, and they will accept everything because they fear too much the Russian military threat. And they are ready to accept everything from any US president. Of course, the situation is different in Italy, in Germany, Spain, and south. So you have a division between the East and the West, between the old and the new Europe, like in 20 years ago with Iraqi war. And but on the other hand, I'm very not sure that Biden, it's of course he will continue to be a good ally for Japan, South Korea, and for European countries, but only against Russia. Not so. One of the most important battles for European countries to reindustrialize themselves, and the European industry is at threat with both U.S. president. If we are telling that the most strategic challenge for us is not the military Russian threat, but to recreate a strong European economy, I'm not sure that there is a better solution than the other on this specific issue. For many other issues, for the climate, of course, for fighting against climate change, it's better to see Harris than Trump. But once again, if for economic reason, it's I think it's very difficult. Of course, I think there is 3 people in the world who hope that Trump will be elected. It's Putin, Netanyahu, and Xi Jinping. Netanyahu because Trump will say everything okay with everything. Putin because he will give up to military help to Ukraine, and Xi Jinping because US will be in turmoil, and so it's a good news for China.
Bill, you want to say a few words?
Well, I thought Putin has said he preferred Harris to Trump, but maybe I'm wrong. But, or it was a strategy from Putin to...
It was a joke just to say. So
course,
in Putin,
I know.
The public opinion of Putin is whatever the US president, US is our enemy. And we don't care, I don't care who will be the next president.
I don't know if you read the Global Compass from the European Union. It's the document that the European Union adopted in March 2022. And it's document that defines European strategy on the world stage. It's a very interesting document, and if you read it through, you will find that everything everything fits with the American vision of the world. There is nothing really different that could be seen as European specific interests different from the American interest. And the thing is, the Europeans don't really know how to define a specific vision apart from very broad ideas about justice, the rule of law. When it comes to specifics, it all the time fits with American interests. And Pascal is right when he says that when Trump was president, it was a shock for Europeans, and for a short time, I remember Angela Merkel and other leaders saying that it's time for us to separate from the United States and be Europeans with our own values and our own vision for the future. But it didn't last, and I don't know if a re-election of I don't know if a re-election of Trump could bring the same shock, but I think, as I said earlier, and as Pascal just said, that concerning the war in Ukraine, the difference between Harris and Trump could be that with Trump, the war could end earlier and faster, and that the Europeans would be just naked before the Russian bear, and it would be urgent for them to react and decide what they want to do for themselves. That could be a real test for them to what can we do when the United States are not with us, and when it comes to very important issues such as the relations with Russia, an aggressive power on our borders.
Another question? We'll take 3 questions at the same time.
I do have 2 questions for me. Yeah. 2 of simple and quick questions. First is, from a European point of view, it's kind of crazy thinking that Trump can be president twice. So what are concretely the factors that are making his success, to really understand what are within the population? And the second one, and we talk about the constitution that may be in danger with Trump re-election, but is there debates within Democrats, within the Democrats, on changing the electoral processes or not? Thank you.
Okay. We take another question at the same time.
Do we have one?
Yes.
Well,
Go first.
Donc, qui a le micro? Il y a 2 personnes qui ont le micro. Allez-y.
Go ahead.
Et on prendra Madame ensuite. On répondra à ces 2 questions et on prendra Madame ensuite.
Okay. I would just like to come back on what you said, Anne-Cécile Robert, about rules-based order. Can you define it first? And you said about that it was a way to break the consensus of 1945, but we actually studied in your class that maybe this model wasn't sustainable anymore. So can you define it and say more about it? Thank you.
Bob first for the first question.
First question, the first 2 questions, very good questions. With regard to, I can't remember who. Anyway, with regard to, if Trump gets elected, why will he be reelected? He'll be elected president for a second time. It will be because the election has been a referendum on the performance of the Biden administration that Kamala Harris was a part of, or the Democratic Party was a part of. And the key indications of why people will vote for Trump by voting against the Democrats, it has to do with their poor performance on economic issues, where inflation dominated the economic issues. Prices rose an enormous amount, and stayed high, and people are still feeling the high prices, particularly on housing, which is lingering on. The other issues of poor performance are the southern border, undocumented immigrants, a big issue. And then the third one that just kind of reminds people of the poor performance is the debacle and how the U.S. left Afghanistan. And people just associate that. They were part of this poor performance syndrome. With regard to the structure of the Constitution, the Electoral College, it would be impossible to change the Constitution and get rid of the Electoral College. It requires a constitutional amendment. The process is too difficult, and there would be opposition to it, particularly among Republicans who have benefited from the Electoral College. Maybe if the Republicans in a presidential election lost the election, even though they won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote, maybe that may make the Republicans think twice about it. The one possible change is in state legislatures right now, there are bills that have been passed. There are voting bills that have been passed where the state legislatures vote to give their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the national vote. And the reason they can do that is because the Constitution says is that the state legislatures determine how the electors are selected. Now, that law would only go into effect. It's part of the law. It only takes effect if enough states have passed the legislation, and those states have at least 270 electoral votes. That hasn't happened yet. It's going to be very difficult. And even if it were passed, it would be taken to court, because this would go into effect when a state has voted. The state voters have voted for a particular candidate, but that candidate's electors will not be put forward. That is, the electors will be put forward for the candidate who wins the national vote. And that would be undermining their right to vote, and the courts may rule against that particular type of legislation.
Maybe a word about that before?
Yes.
Yeah, just quickly. May I?
No.
Okay, just quickly, what Bob said is really important. The fact that the economy, inflation, and border security are the key issues for most people, for the more important portion of electors this year. And it affects voters in different blocks of groups of voters. And you see some things that can be very surprising, but it shows the effect of this bad economy and of Biden's record on Harris's chances to win on November 5. If you look at Latino voters, for instance, okay, Biden won 63% of Latino voters in 2020. Harris right now, if you look at polls, like a poll that was released a few days ago by the Pew Research Center, is getting 57% of this vote, the Latino vote, so 6% less. So she still have work to do, and this is related to the economy, to dissatisfaction with Biden's record in part. Black voters, African-American voters, Biden got 90% of that vote in 2020. Harris is at 84% right now, so 6% less. It can change, but that's a challenge right now. Women voters, Biden got 57% in 2020. Harris is at 22% right now. So you might think that this was a political earthquake. Of course, Harris is giving Democrats a chance to win the White House, but there's still dissatisfaction with Biden's record, and it affects all voters because all these voters are something. They have an identity, but they care about the economy. Sometimes they care about border security. They care about criminality. They care about issues that transcend the fact that they have these identities that I just mentioned. So the good news for Harris is that she has become more popular personally over the last few weeks, and that's good news for her. I think you mentioned that, Bob, but when Biden left the race on July 21, she was at 32% of favorability. So only 32% of Americans had a favorable opinion of her. Now she's at 48%, which means that the more people see her on the campaign trail, the more they like her. But it remains to be seen if this can go up. But right now, she's the most popular person on both tickets, Republican and Democratic ticket. Trump is at 40% favorability. J.D. Vance, 32%, not super popular. Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's running mate, is at 40%. So Kamala Harris is likable. She's shown for many voters that she is presidential, that she can run the country, especially in the last debate against Trump. But this record, Biden's record on the economy and immigration, like Bob said, is really difficult for her.
Okay, quickly, One more
last
question with this
yeah.
lady. One question from somebody online.
I'm going to stand so you can see that I'm who's speaking to you. As an American who's lived in France for over 30 years, forgive me if I make a few parallels between the two systems to parlay the us and them theory. Trump uses a lot of negative messaging, threatening, saying, for example, to farmers that they will no longer have farms, or saying to workers that they're going to lose their tips. And it's all about money, quite often. In France, we have the same sort of thing going on in the elections with simple messaging and threats about immigration and things that are very, very similar. So if Trump becomes elected, it is also an open door policy to a lot of different countries in Europe, it seems. Do you find that there is similarities and not so many differences? Because I've heard the US is like this, but we are in our corner between the two ends of the world, the two sides of the pond, as they say.
Well, just that there was a question about the rules-based order. That could be a conference in itself. What I can say, there's no. It's the trick. There is no definition of the rules-based order outside the American and speeches and what they can write and say all along well, anyway, but the thing is that in the rules-based order, they pick the rules, you know, and most of the time you can see two things. First, there are a lot of references to the rule of law, rights of man, things that we all share here. But on the world stage, we know that those things divide the international community. Of course, all the countries don't have the same vision, to say the least, about the rights of man, about the rule of law. It's the reason why in the UN Charter you don't find many things about that. But in the UN Charter, you find things about the use of force, about borders, about peacekeeping, and that's very precise. In the rules-based order, the other thing I said, you can find two things. The other thing you find is a change in the rules concerning the use of force. You know that the UN Charter prohibits the use of force and foreign meddling. In the rules-based order, you have you can find reasons to use war against an opponent. That's why I think it's part of some kind of crusade that the Western countries, not only the Americans, are building against their opponents.
One question online. Is it a risk of civil war in case of if Trump loses election? I will answer to this question. I published a book on the subject on January 15. No, it's not a risk of a civil war if Trump loses the election. We'll have some tension, some maybe violence. It will be worse probably than in January 21, but not a civil war as the one we got in the 19th century. No. If it's a risk of civil war in America, it will come later, way later. For the moment, the country is, I don't know in English, in déliquescence. And we have to end this processes of delicacies to see trouble as a civil war if it happens one day, but I don't trust we'll get a civil war very soon. In 2 words to conclude?
Things with
yes, about the lady and about civil war.
Oh, there was the question about the comparison between France and the U.S. The one thing I will say about that is that the negative messaging in the U.S. is real, the way you've talked about it. It's even worse. But the one big difference between France and the U.S., the election campaign in the United States has been going on for at least a year and a half. Okay, at least in France, whatever goes on, it's an hour period. I really can't comment on the kind of substantive difference, if any, between the two countries, because I don't know enough about France. With regard to the Civil War, you know, we can conjure up worst case scenarios here. It is the case that the militant groups in the United States, the Proud Boys and those other groups, are still alive and well. Their membership is as large as ever, maybe even more. It's true that their leaders and many of their followers were arrested and convicted because of what they did on January 6th. But that threat is real. The proliferation of guns in the United States, assault weapons, is real. It's possible there could be violence. Against that, you have Joseph Biden as president, not Donald Trump, with the National Guard under his control and ready to be used if necessary. And in terms of the balance of forces here are really overwhelming in favor of the government, which makes this hard to believe. And those thinking of misbehaving in a certain way probably understand that.
Ok, j'ai reçu pas mal, sorry, I will speak in French, pas mal d'emails me disant on aurait aimé une traduction. C'est vrai, la prochaine fois on essaiera d'avoir une traduction et on voulait quelques mots en français, donc je conclurai en français. Merci à tous, thank you very much Bob, merci d'être venu. Si vous voulez en savoir plus, vous pouvez aller sur le site de l'IRIS et sur la page de l'Observatoire politique et géostratégique des États-Unis que je dirige et vous aurez des textes de Bob, d'Anne-Cécile et de Frédéric. Merci.